if you break someone's legs and give them crutches, right? Okay, fine. But instead of worrying about taking away the crutches, stop hurting their legs.
Welcome to the Lions of Liberty podcast. Here is your host, your guide, your shining beacon of liberty, Marc Clair.
By hook or by crook, you found yourselves once again listening to this show, the Lions of Liberty podcast. This is episode number 148. Today's show notes can be found over at lionsofliberty.com/148. Today's show is sponsored by our friends at Health Excellence Select, an amazing, affordable alternative to Obamacare insurance. To learn more, head over to lionsofliberty.com/health. We are also sponsored by our good friend Dan McCall over at Liberty Maniacs, who has filled my drawer with awesome Liberty and satirical shirts. If you want a 10% discount on your entire order, you can use the discount code Lions of Liberty at checkout. That's libertymaniacs.com. My guest today is a professor of economics at St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York. He's the author of several books, including Micro Foundations and Macroeconomics, an Austrian Perspective, Monetary Evolution, Free Banking, and Economic Order, and most recently, a new book he's just put out entitled Hayek's Modern Family. He writes regularly at several websites, including Bleeding Heart Libertarians, Coordination Problem, and the Foundation for Economic Education, FEE, where he recently wrote an article entitled Don't Smash the State, which we'll be discussing a little bit later here today. He is, of course, Steve Horwitz. Welcome to the Lions of Liberty podcast, Steve.
Oh, it's glad to be here, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you here, Steve. And as I mentioned at the top there, we'll be discussing your article, Don't Smash the State, in a bit here. But as I do with all my guests, I like to first get to know you a little bit better. So why don't you just start off telling us about yourself? How did you first become interested in economics and liberty?
Well, I can talk first about how I became a libertarian, and then the economics will come from that. I've been a libertarian since I was 16, so I was an early bloomer. And I was always, as a teenager, like a lot of young men are, especially young men who become libertarians, I was into sci-fi and kind of weird stuff. Anyone who had a kind of weird, wacky theory, chariots of the gods and all that kind of stuff, Bible prophecy, whatever. And I used to work at the public library. One day a book came across the shelf there, a new book called Restoring the American Dream by a guy named Robert Ringer, who was an investment type and a libertarian. This was 1979, 1980. And, here's a guy with a theory, right? Different way of looking at the world. And the book was basically a case for libertarianism. I got the book from the library, read it, and was persuaded, and then went into the library's card catalog and started finding the stuff that was in his references. I believe the next book I read was Murray Rothbard's For a New Liberty. And so that's like kind of from the, frying pan into the fire sort of thing. So from there, I just started following up the people who they were talking about, and I started reading more libertarian stuff. I read Ayn Rand shortly after that. I actually came across Rand in a high school AP literature class, which was great. And then I read some Rand, and I started reading the Austrian Economist. And I went to college intending to be in computer science. And my freshman year, I thought to myself, well, if I'm going to be serious about this libertarian stuff, I probably should know some economics. So I took Intro Econ my second semester of my freshman year as kind of a fifth course just to have it. And I think I had that moment that lots of economists have, where you're in that class and you're there and you go, wow, you have the scales fall from your eyes and the world makes sense, and you go, yeah, this is how I've always thought about things, but now someone has kind of systematized it. And so from there, I was, I got into economics. I majored in economics and philosophy at University of Michigan and did my PhD work at George Mason University in the late 80s. And the rest, as they say, is history.
It's a very common theme I find from my guests that a lot of people first get the wheels turning on this stuff from works of fiction, particularly science fiction. Robert Heinlein is often mentioned. Of course, everyone mentions Ayn Rand. So, it's really interesting how we don't start to think about things like this in a deeper way, the sort of consequences of our political thought until we can actually see sort of a fictionalized version of how a lot of this stuff plays out. So I always find that fascinating.
Yeah, and fiction lets us also critique the status quo in creative and interesting ways. I'm still the only person I know, though, personally anyway, for whom that Ringer book actually made them a libertarian. So that's my little unique claim to fame, at least among my friends anyway.
Well, we're almost 150 episodes into the show, and I can confirm you're the first one to bring that name up. So you're right so far.
Empirical evidence.
Steve, I'll let you explain in further detail in a second about this article you recently wrote, Don't Smash the State. And it's basically an idea that's often heard in libertarian circles. You mentioned Sheldon Richman had made this analogy back in 1981 in an article about basically seeing the state or the government as an onion, and how, instead of peeling back the layers, we just need to smash the onion. And this is kind of similar to a concept that's been put forth by Murray Rothbard, who you reference as a major influence. He would always say, if you could push a button today to end the state, would you do it? And of course, Rothbard considered himself to be a button pusher, or an abolitionist, as he would refer to it. And you also mentioned this is an attitude you used to share as well, and that you used to agree with it when you were a lot younger. So why don't we just start there? What about that concept that put forth there, the idea of screw this incrementalist stuff, forget trying to peel back laws, we just need to end the state overnight and get there as fast as possible? So what back then, 1981 Steve Horwitz, what about that appealed to him?
Well, I think part of it is, when you're a young man and young woman, you're sort of filled with passion, and especially passion and injustice. And by the way, the pushing the button thing is not Rothbard's original. That's Leonard Read, of all people, from Fee, who wrote a piece called "I'd Push the Button," and Murray picked it up from Leonard Read. But anyway, so I think when you're young, right, that's where you are. You're angry. The world sucks, and you want to make the world a better place, and you tend to sort of see things in radical ways. And I think you're also, you are not quite there in terms of understanding that things are often more complex than they seem to be. And I think my younger self, and I'm still very sympathetic, don't get me wrong, right? I mean, injustice anywhere, right, as Martin Luther King said, right? It's sort of leaving any injustice anywhere, right, is a problem. So I think my younger self was just, you know what, the state is evil and wrong and bad, and we just got to smash it and get rid of it and start, sort of start clean. And when you then start to think about what that really means, and about the way in which people, sort of social institutions are structured, it's just more complicated than that. And there's a moral dimension to it too, which I kind of touch on in the piece for the Freeman too.
So when did that first start to change for you? Was there a moment that it stands out when you said, you know what, I got to kind of rethink this concept that I had been so kind of clinging to for some time?
I don't think there was any one moment. I think it's a slow process. I certainly think part of it is one of the sort of things that generated that was the more kind of I was identifying as a bleeding heart libertarian. And the bleeding heart part there is not the sort of, I still think of myself, as sort of philosophically an anarchist. It's just a question of how do we get there, right? And I think the bleeding heart part reminds us that we have to be mindful about how not just the state, but getting rid of the state impacts the least well off among us. And so I think thinking about some of those issues and thinking about how to unwind the state in a way that is humane as well as just, I think is part of what got me thinking about those issues.
Now, you weren't a huge fan, at least now you're not, of the onion analogy, the peeling back the layers analogy, or smashing the onion, as Sheldon Richman put forth, and you use a different analogy in your article, and you're relating the state or coercive government, whatever we want to call it, to a bomb. So why don't you just describe your analogy there a little bit?
Some friends who are, bomb experts suggest maybe this isn't how it actually works, but sort of the movie version is, right? When you defuse a bomb, you got to, it's a bomb, right? And when you defuse a bomb, you got to be careful. You can't just, sort of necessarily just smash it, right? Or just, blowing up trying to blow up the bomb, right? This is not going to work. The movie version anyways, you got to cut the wires, and you got to cut the wires in the right order. Perhaps if you don't cut them in the right order, the bomb goes off. And so for me, it's a question of, as we think about diffusing the bomb that is the state, how do we diffuse it? How do we get rid of it in a way that ensures that we cut the wires, right? That we peel back the layers in the right order to ensure that we do this in a way that doesn't make it blow up in our face and make matters worse. And what's interesting, by the way, is, Sheldon Richman is a good friend of mine, longtime friend of mine. And I think Sheldon doesn't quite believe the argument he made in that paper either, judging by some things he said on Facebook about my piece in the Freeman. So I think, again, there's another case, whereas, when you're younger, you think one thing, when you get older, you see it, and it's a little more complicated as you get older.
Now, one thing you bring up in this article is, there's a couple things you address, and there's a few methods you come at this from, and one of them is simply that the world we live in today, there are different ways to get around the state, get around a lot of the coercive laws that a lot of libertarians are against, and you sort of say that makes our situation now different than it was when that article was written in 1981. So can you expand on that a little bit? Why do you see it being easier now to get around the sort of the machinations of the state?
Technology is a big part of it, right? I mean, we can avoid the taxi monopoly with Uber. We can, encrypt our email and avoid the spying eyes of the state, right? Where it's easier for us to engage in exchanges by sort of meeting people online in ways that we couldn't have done in the past. And so all of those give us a certain degree of freedom and a freedom to work around government, buying stuff over the internet that might get taxed in one place, not another. It's all kinds of examples of this. So I think back in the 80s, the sense was if you wanted to be free, you had to smash the part of the state that was, making you unfree. And while that's still, I think, right, you can also become free by just driving around it, right? There's alternatives, there's ways around the barriers that the state sets up that didn't used to be there, or at least weren't as easy to access. I think there's lots of examples.
Do you think there's anything to this idea that, there are new technologies that help us, on the surface sort of avoid the state? Like you said, if we don't like taxis, great, we can take a Lyft or an Uber. But the more that these technologies sort of expand, we see where Lyft and Uber and other companies like them eventually have to end up becoming part of the state in a way, because a lot of cities wouldn't allow Uber and Lyft once the word started sort of getting out and the taxi lobbies came and started lobbying and that kind of thing. And now you have states and cities where they are finally allowing Uber and Lyft in, but they're doing so in a somewhat regulatory manner. They're basically having to lobby to get this position, and now it's at the point where we have Uber in one city or locale, but it's not like Johnny down the street could just open his car and start his own Uber business. So there is just still an element of the state's involvement in pretty much everything.
Absolutely. Still, those are options, we didn't have in the past. I don't think it's possible to sort of live this purely state-free life by working around it. All I'm suggesting is that it's easier to work around the state, and it's easier to come up with alternatives to the things that the state controls than it used to be, say, 30 or 40 years ago.
There's two major paths you take towards the same point here, and I think a lot of libertarians might be able to get on with the first half of this, and that is the strategic part, and the other part of that is the moral part, but we'll start with the strategic part first. So why don't you think that strategically it's very important to talk about doing things in sort of a gradual manner?
Well, I think it's about creating alliances, right? There's not enough libertarians to smash the state. There just isn't, right? There's more than there were when Sheldon wrote that piece, but there's not enough. And so the only way we're going to generate any kind of rollback of the state, in the real world, sort of all moving to New Hampshire or Mars or whatever, is we're going to have to work with other groups. For example, find coalitions, say, to roll back the state's involvement in the schools. We'll have to work with, perhaps, hopefully, the left, what's left of it, to roll back, the NSA or whatever. We'll have to work with entrepreneurs, maybe, to roll back economic regulation, though certainly many of them, taxi companies like regulation, right? So we have to look for those opportunities where we can find alliances and coalitions to generate enough. And it's not just a matter of political support. It's kind of cultural support, right? Where we can persuade people that these are good things. I think this generation of young people in their 20s, right, is growing up used to these kind of, working around the state and the freedom to buy and sell from their phone and all these sorts of things. So they're there for the picking, right, if we can find the issues that are interesting to them, even if they don't call themselves libertarians. And I think that's the key strategically.
Do you think that part of that strategy, that principled libertarians, people that are against the initiation of force, we can define it loosely that way, I suppose, do you think that when forming these alliances that people need to hide their sort of true principles or play politics in that kind of way? Or do you think that you need to form these alliances, be reasonable, but at the same time sort of put your whole philosophy out there?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right what you said at the end, Mark. I think you can say I'm a libertarian. I'd like to get rid of all these things, but you know what? This issue is really important, and you guys, and it's important to you too. So let's work together, right? I mean, a group, let's say Black Lives Matter, right, wants to end the war on drugs to get black men out of prison. Okay, we don't have to agree with them on everything. They can be, economically a bunch of socialists. But if they're really serious about moving forward on that particular issue, then they ought to be willing to work with us. And the fact that we differ on these other things shouldn't matter. The key, though, is if you're going to build those coalitions and work on particular issues, just stick to the issue. You don't have to insert your libertarianism into everything else or sort of insist on some kind of ideological purity from those folks. If they're sincere about rolling back the war on drugs, then let's work with them. Let's make it happen. Same with anti-war movement, too.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically taking the sort of the concept of ending the left-right paradigm where we're always jumping to one side or the other to even further and saying end all paradigms that we have and stop trying to jump to purist statements within every single sort of position we might take.
That's right. You can still hold out the purist position as where you want to go, but you can recognize that if I can work with some people to make us freer, why shouldn't I work with them, right? If you're letting purity be the enemy of improving freedom, I don't think you're getting it, right? Because you can stand there and be pure all day long, but it may not make any difference to actually making more people more free.
Right, and libertarians are certainly fall victim to this as well because, hey, if you post a meme by Noam Chomsky, say, like a noted leftist, although he calls himself an anarchist too, there might be some philosophical confusion there, but, I mean, he's great on anti-war stuff, he's great on the empire, but if you post a meme of him with some quote, you're going to get a lot of likes on it, but you're also going to get a lot of people saying, hey, that guy's a leftist, why are you posting this stuff? He's a crazy progressive communist, yada, 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 because people are still trapped in that whole, all or nothing sort of...
That's right.
This sort of scope.
Those people get the freedom they deserve, which isn't much, right? If you're going to just reject people reject people with good ideas on the basis that they also have some bad ideas, you're going to be standing in a room with two people, right? I mean, there's no one who doesn't have flaws. I wrote a Freeman piece about this a while back, something like black hats and white hats or something like that, how we have to, I even know when it was in August of 2013, about how we have to not, just because someone believes some things that are wrong doesn't mean they don't also believe some things that are right. And we have to not dismiss the right stuff because they also say some wrong stuff. No one's pure. I mean, no one's pure.
Libertarians of all ilks, regardless of if they agree on philosophy or their moral outlook, I think most libertarians share a sort of general moral outlook. They'll always disagree strategically. But this isn't just a strategic argument that you make here. You also make a moral argument for why it would be wrong to simply smash the state or, push the button or what have you. So why don't you just explain the moral into this? Because that's something where I think you might receive a little more feedback, a little more traction, because people will say, well, what do you mean the moral argument? We all agree that coercion is wrong, that aggression is wrong. How can you possibly say it would be immoral to just end it overnight?
Yeah. Well, okay. So I think the problem there, right, is that if you think coercion is the only moral thing that matters, that's a problem, right? And while coercion is important, right? For me, I think there's also a moral obligation to try to make the world a better place for the least well-off among us. And my argument I make in the piece is using the sort of welfare system as an example. If you want to shut down the welfare system because it's coercive, you can do that. But if you do that before you've given people the opportunity, more of an opportunity to earn an income, right? You're being grossly unfair to them. The welfare system has impoverished many Americans, and along with economic regulations like minimum wage laws and licensing laws and the like, has cut off upward mobility for Americans. So we've made it harder for poor people to get wealthier, and then we've sort of bought them off with the welfare state. If you take away the welfare state, but don't open up the opportunities for them to make themselves, move upward mobility, right? You're really being unfair to them. You're saying, oh, we're not going to let you move up, and we're going to take away, the analogy I use in the article is, if you break someone's legs and give them crutches, right? Okay, fine. But instead of worrying about taking away the crutches, stop hurting their legs, okay? We can't, if you broke someone's legs, in some sense, you owe them the crutches. And if you take away the crutches, that seems grossly, immoral to me. So the real argument there was about the sequence we peel back the onion, right? I think there's ways we have to do it that are more moral than others. And for me, one of those is freeing up the economy, particularly freeing up the opportunities for sort of low-income Americans before we take away the welfare system. You can make a different argument about Social Security that, people have planned their whole retirements around Social Security. And if you suddenly say, oh, just smash Social Security, you've left a lot of people out in the cold who, plan their lives around a promise made by government. And if you want to say, well, they shouldn't have done that, I think, you're imposing libertarian values on people in a way that just isn't possible. And again, that's why I think while coercion is important, it's not the only moral value that we might consider when we think about moving towards a libertarian society. And let me add to that real quick. A policy that increases net coercion is a bad policy, right? From a libertarian perspective. A policy that decreases net coercion, even if it doesn't decrease it a lot, or there's other coercion left, is a good policy still, right? The point is if you think coercion's the problem, the point is to reduce it, even if you can't eliminate it at one sort of fell swoop.
And even bouncing back to the strategic thing for a moment, I mean, if libertarians, let's say libertarians have a clean sweep of the House and Senate somehow, a libertarian president comes in and the libertarians go, cool, we can bring libertarianism here now. welfare's done, Social Security's done. That's the first step. And everyone goes, wait a minute, we needed that. We were relying on that. What do you mean? And then suddenly you've got all these people who just associate libertarianism with heartlessness, with tossing people out on the streets and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and this isn't quite the same as strategic, but from a rhetorical perspective, right? It's going to make us more friends and build more alliances if we focus on getting rid of the barriers to upward mobility, for example, than we do on yanking away the welfare state. Yeah, we should do both. But if we're sort of trying to make the case to other people to say, we really do care about people, we want to give them opportunity, we want everyone to have a chance at becoming wealthier, let's focus on the one thing more often as opposed to the blowing up the welfare state.
So, Steve, let's just envision something for a moment, if you don't mind. You're sitting there, you've got the state, the bomb in front of you, and you've got all these wires sticking out, and you got to pick the first one to snip. So, going with your analogy, what's the first wire that you would snip? What's the first policy that you would try to roll back immediately?
Well, okay, so I'm Lord Tsar of the country. I can do whatever I want. First thing I do is bring the military home. I mean, we got to stop killing brown people. It's that simple. That's not even about Americans. That's low-hanging fruit as far as coercion goes. Let's stop being the world's policeman and the world's baby killer and everything else. Let's bring the troops home. So if we think about domestic policies, I mean, it reflects my own biases as an economist and the things I'm interested in. But certainly, I would look. One of the places I'd look is at monetary policy and the Fed, right? If there are ways you could, if not end the Fed, at least dramatically reduce what the Fed's doing. But after that, I'm going to start looking at some of the things we've talked about. What are the policies that can have major impact on the least well-off among us? End the war on drugs. Eliminate minimum wage laws. Make public schools more competitive. Some form of school choice. Occupational licensure laws, let's get rid of those, zoning laws, all this, all this kind of stuff that makes it really, really difficult for people with limited skills to either get those skills and get that education or to move up. I mean, that seems to me to be both, practical and humane and coercion reducing set of things that I would try to do first.
Well, why don't we take a look at just a couple of those examples real quick? And one of them you mentioned there is minimum wage. And some people might argue, well, yeah, I can see all the things you're saying about minimum wage and how it hinders job opportunities and it really just affects the people that are already poor. But, some people might say, well, look, we have this corporatist economy. It's almost impossible to, get a job or support yourself without working for some corporation. So what would you say to the argument that minimum wage is actually one of the last wires that should be pulled after, corporate regulation is ended and after patents are ended and that sort of thing?
Yeah. Except I think the premise in there that's wrong is this: you can't get a job unless it's for some big corporation. I just don't think that's true. And the reality is that if that is true, one of the reasons is minimum wage laws, right? Walmart's not paying minimum wage; they're paying above minimum wage, right? It's mom and pop stores are getting harmed by minimum wage. So if you really want to make it more feasible for people to get jobs outside corporate America and sort of the corporate world, the first thing you ought to do is eliminate minimum wage laws because, again, Walmart's in favor of raising the minimum wage, right? So, I'm not sure that's a good reason not to do it. I mean, and let me add, we got to only 3 items on my list, but certainly eliminating corporate subsidies and corporate welfare and all that kind of stuff would be very high on my list of things to do, arguably next after opening up the low end of the job market.
Let's touch on the Federal Reserve really quickly. And, a lot of people will say, and this might be another area where smashing could cause a lot of harm, because if you just remove it one day and suddenly, who knows what our money's worth, or, we really don't know right now anyway, yeah. But what are some ways, I guess, maybe from your economic background, you can see that you could reasonably sort of curtail a lot of the damage the Federal Reserve is doing while making people more freer and not seeing people just completely lose any savings they had overnight or what have you?
I think this is a case where smashing, wouldn't have quite as much damage as it might in other places. But there's a whole bunch of proposals out there by the people who write on free banking and so on to think in terms of freezing the monetary base and letting banks then issue their own currency, their own liabilities on top of that frozen monetary base. There's some things you could do with how the Fed, again, put limits on the Fed conducting open market operations. There's ways you could do it without completely getting rid of the Fed right away. I think it's a really important and interesting intellectual and political challenge to think about how you would unwind the Fed, how you would peel back the layers. But I think it's not quite the same as, say, the welfare thing, right? You still have to be careful in the order you do things. But the benefits from, taking good whacks at the Fed and really reducing it are much greater, I think, with less risk than in some other places.
I want to address your first one that you mentioned there, because it is one that seems so simple and so obvious on the surface. This is what Ron Paul would always say. It's what got him so much support from so many people, including myself, is when he would go up there and just say, bring them home, bring all the troops home. And, knowing what our government is doing all around the world and all the terrible rights violations it's involved in, it's very easy to say, let's just bring them all home. But do you think there's any concern that if you literally just brought troops home, say, tomorrow, that could even be a situation where some damage could be caused? Let's just, off the top of my head, again, I'm no foreign policy expert here, but let's say all our troops left South Korea tomorrow, and they actually wanted our troops there, and we said, sorry guys, we're smashing the military at least. Yeah. We're bringing this stuff home. Yeah. You think that there's a danger to actually fall out from that? Because who knows, maybe North Korea says, great, now we got it. Now we can go in and take this whole peninsula over for ourselves.
Yeah, again, realistically, you can't just say bring everyone home and then the next day, right, abandon all the bases and everyone. You got to have a process for doing it. And it seems to me, again, analogous, cutting the wires in the right order. What do we do first? First, we stop bombing people, right? That's the easy one. Let's stop bombing people. Let's get out of these other countries that clearly don't want us there. Then we can worry about what to do about troops in, say, Western Europe or South Korea. Those are the places we might go last. And that gives those places time to think about how they're now going to defend themselves in the absence of American help. So sure, I guess what I'd say is there's kind of two levels of priority. There's priority about which issues libertarians might think are the most important that we want to tackle first. And then within each of those issues, there's got to be a process for how, what's the most important thing we should do first. And then, because you're not just going to be able to snap your fingers and do anything overnight. Well, I shouldn't say anything, some things, right? You can't just snap your fingers and do them overnight. So what order do we do them in? And it seems to me, here's where, ending the worst coercion or the coercion that has the worst consequences first seems to me to be the smart way to go.
Steve, there's one more example I would just like to toss at you because It was brought up by a member of our forum on Facebook, the Lions of Liberty Forum, where a lot of our fans are in there asking questions. And I mentioned I was doing this interview today. And the great guy, a member of our forum, Kyle, he brought up a situation in Ohio where he's from. And this is something we've written about on our website, Lions of Liberty, before. There's a big move for cannabis legalization going on in Ohio. Obviously, on its surface, that's a positive for anyone of a libertarian bent. But part of this bill that's being pushed through is that it would legalize cannabis, but it would only allow this very specific one company to have basically a monopoly on the industry. So while, yes, marijuana is now, becoming legalized and potentially less people are going to go to jail for it, which is obviously great, now you've also entrenched a cartel, essentially, in the state of Ohio, and who knows if you'll ever be able to roll that back. Obviously, all these issues I could ever bring up are going to have shades of gray, are going to be very nuanced, but I'm just curious how you see something like that, where if you think even maybe something that gives us more freedom on the surface could actually entrench something that could be bad in a totally different way.
I think there's no principled answer to those questions, right? It comes down to our judgment about, is this mixed bag a net gain or not? My own view of that would be, yeah, I really wish that it weren't being handed over to a private sector monopoly. But if we're really decriminalizing it, and that means we're not going to be putting people in jail, and that means we're going to get maybe some Fourth Amendment rights back, and the people being put in jail will mostly, will not be disproportionately non-white, right? These are all pretty good reasons and pretty significant benefits, it seems to me, that we might want to weigh off against, the cost of it being done in a way that we think is less than ideal. But again, that's a judgment on my part. I don't think there's anything sort of, that won't be true for everyone, okay? And I think other people can see it a different way. But it seems to me, if you have the opportunity to get back some Fourth Amendment rights and to keep people out of cages, that's pretty important.
Sure. And any issue that involves nuance, which pretty much all the examples that we've talked about do in some way, there's never a 100% right or wrong answer. You can have a principle that's correct, but how it actually applies to a nuanced situation is a totally different thing. And that's why I think your article is so important to point this stuff out. I'm really glad you posted this article. We'll, of course, link to it in the show notes for the show as well. Steve, thank you so much for joining me today. Before I let you go, why don't you just give everyone a quick roundup of how anything I might have missed that you're working on, how they can find your latest book, and how they can contact you?
Well, the best way to follow what I'm doing is Facebook. My personal page is, I'm at the friend limit, but I have a public figure page that you can certainly like, and you can my personal page you can follow, though you can't friend me. That's a good way. Bleeding Heart Libertarians and Coordination Problem, another good way. Every 2 weeks at Fee, as you mentioned, I have a column there. The new book, Hayek's Modern Family, is available at Amazon. It's very expensive because it's an academic book. I'm hopeful I'll be able to get a paperback of that out sometime soon. You might after a while, people might search around the web, see if they can find a PDF of it. There's ways that those things get up there, Your listeners who don't know, I do videos for Learn Liberty, project of Institute for Humane Studies at learnliberty.org, so you can check out some of my videos there too.
Steve Horwitz, thank you so much once again for joining us on Lions of Liberty, and keep up the great work.
Thank you, Mark. My pleasure to be here.
All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed my conversation there with Steve Horwitz. I've got some thoughts of my own, of course, coming up in the last roar in just a moment. But first, I want to tell you about our great sponsors. And Steve mentioned getting around the state and ways we can get around a lot of the regulations and the laws that we hate. And one thing people of many political persuasions, not just libertarians, not even just conservatives, are upset about is Obamacare and the onerous regulations and mandates, as well as the requirement to purchase insurance being forced upon all of us. And one way to get around that is by checking out our friends at Health Excellence Select and the awesome concept of health sharing. That's right, you do not have to purchase this corporatist health insurance that lays out all the different things that you need to have and all the premiums that you can pay and all of this stuff. You don't need to do that. It might make sense for some people. I'm not saying nobody should go onto Obamacare. If you're in a low income bracket, that probably is the most logical thing for you to do. But if you are like me and buy your own health insurance, or if you're someone who's getting kicked off your health insurance because of this, well, you need to look into Health Excellence Select. Find the doctors you need and get the services you need at the best price. They have 24/7 access to doctors via Skype, so you don't even need to go to a doctor's office half the time or spend a dime. And you can get all sorts of discounts on medical services and dental services. There really is no reason not to be looking into this. You can learn more at lionsofliberty.com/health. We are also brought to you today by our good friend Dan McCall and his website libertymaniacs.com, where you can find all sorts of awesome political and satirical gear. And guys, I don't just say that. I've got 5 or 6 of his t-shirts sitting in my drawer right now. This is really awesome stuff. If you haven't seen the Donald Trump shirt, We Shall Overcome, let me tell you, go to libertymaniacs.com/pages/lions and check it out, because if you go through that link, you can receive a 10% discount off your entire order. You can also do so just by simply using the discount code Lions of Liberty at checkout. But be sure to check out libertymaniacs.com. Wear your beliefs on your sleeve, like me. All right, guys, and this concept that I discussed today with Steve Horwitz is a very, very important one. And I will say I've had somewhat of a transformation myself when it comes to this issue, because I was in my mid to late 20s when I was discovering libertarianism and really reading about these ideas. But you could say I intellectually grew up reading a lot of Murray Rothbard, and I think his contributions are excellent in many ways. But when it comes to this smash the state thing, or the smash the onion, I suppose you might say, or the pushing the button, as Leonard Read first coined the term, we need to think about things in a different way. Because, yeah, I'm an abolitionist. I want to end slavery overnight. Some ills are so blatant and wrong that you can rally the public behind them, and you cannot do anything but say, this is blatantly wrong. This needs to end. To me, we can compare that right now to the war on drugs. There is no reason to wind down the war on drugs. Nobody is harmed other than the people that are doing the harming, that are profiting off the war on drugs, the prisons that are profiting off using prison labor, the corporations that are profiting off the same thing, the pharmaceutical companies that are profiting off the fact that legal alternatives such as marijuana, of course that's changing, and other, street drugs you might call them, are providing to them the competition from those drugs. They want that stuff eliminated. There are some people that will be harmed in economic terms, I guess you might say, but those people should be harmed. The people that are doing injustice should lose, whatever profits they are reaping from injustices. So some things I think are very easy to say, end this now. This is wrong. If slavery existed, I would say, yes, that's one of them. And today we have the war on drugs, and that's one of them to me. End it now. But when we talk about ending the state, when we talk about ending everything the government is currently doing, well, A, that's not a very philosophical position to take. People are just going to think you're crazy. End the state, end the government, but then what? Then what? Then what? That's what most people are going to think when they hear that. And unless you have all those answers, you might want to point them to, 16 Murray Rothbard books or what have you, or, books about liberty and law and the private development of law. Look, these are all great things to look into. But that's not how you're going to change the world. It's just not. It's really not. We have to form alliances. We have to find people that have common ground and hold hands with them strongly, firmly, and make changes to policies that are currently harming people. And we need to do that in a reasonable and rational way. Now, I am an abolitionist in the sense, I want to end all coercion tomorrow. If I could snap my fingers and end all the injustices at once, I would. However, the way our system is set up, while there are many injustices taking place, there are many attempts to address those injustices within the system. So, look, many things that the government has done over the years, such as regulation, high taxation, patents, for example, a lot of those things have hindered people economically in many, many ways. Those things are wrong. I want to end those things. And then there have been other paths taken through government to sort of hedge against those things, okay? Now, some of those are misguided. I don't think minimum wage is a wise way to hedge against the ills of the state. But some ways include welfare. People are given welfare because a lot of people are poor, and we can point to a lot of the government policies that are creating a lot of that poverty. But you got to look at the right order to do things, because if you just take away welfare tomorrow and you don't at the same time or earlier end all the regulation, end everything that is hindering people's progress, end the education system that is hindering them intellectually, and change that, you're leaving people basically out to dry. And not only is that strategically a problem, because progressives on the left are going to say, you're heartless, you have no heart, you're just a greedy capitalist, and they'll get this image of the guy with the top hat and the cigar just laughing his way to the bank. Well, you know what? If we advocate to just end welfare and end the state and end everything tomorrow, well, that is the image they're going to get. And this is an analogy presented by my friend Jonathan Hubbard, so I want to give a shout out to him. But you can look at it as a game of Jenga, okay? And every single policy is sitting in this sort of Jenga thing. Now, the way you lose Jenga is you pull out the wrong block and the whole thing topples over. Okay, we don't want to lose Jenga, guys. We want to win. Winning Jenga in this case is advancing liberty, is creating a freer society. Losing Jenga, having it all tumble down, that would be inviting in tyranny, for example. So if you just smash the state and you pull out the wrong block and the Jenga tower just falls over, well, someone's going to come in and say, hey, look how these guys played Jenga. Get them out of here. And then that's how you invite in tyranny. That's when the people look to a strong leader like Adolf Hitler did. The economy of Germany was in shambles. People were on the streets. He came in and said, well, we're going to institute these changes. I'm going to be strong. I'm going to take charge. Well, we all know what happened there. It's extremely important to pull the blocks out in the right order. Pull that war on drugs, snatch it right out. Great, because the whole thing's not going to come tumbling down from that. But if you pull welfare out first, well, now all you've got are a bunch of people on the street, a bunch of people who see the libertarians, oh, they took away my welfare, but I'm still hindered here. I still have no way to advance myself in life. That's a problem. I'm opposed to redistributive income. I'm opposed to welfare in concept in a vacuum. But if we're going to talk about actually ending policies, actually repealing onerous legislation, that must be done in a proper order. And I'm glad that Steve was able to come on the show and explain his position, because I think this is a very important subject, both strategically and morally, as we discussed. Now, I mentioned Kyle from the Lions of Liberty Forum. He got his question in to Steve Horwitz, and you guys can too. If you're on Facebook, well, you should do a couple things. First, you should go to facebook.com/Lions of Liberty and like our main Facebook page. But then you can also go in your little search bar and type Lions of Liberty Forum, and then you can join our private group and get engaged in these conversations. You can talk to myself, talk to some of our fellow contributors, talk to some past guests of the show. When I have guests on, I'll ask you for feedback. I'll ask you for input. I'll ask you if you have any questions. And just like Kyle, your question might make it onto the show. So please come on over and join us in the Lions of Liberty Forum. If you're a tweeter, well, find us on Twitter at Lions of Liberty. You can find links to everything we discussed on today's show over at our website at lionsofliberty.com/148. You can also hear us on the radio at libertytalk.fm, 6 p.m. Eastern every single Saturday and Sunday, and throughout the week on the Liberty Radio Network at lrn.fm. And be sure to come on back this upcoming Thursday, where we will have a Lions of Liberty podcast. First, you may have heard several of our reaction shows to the GOP debates. Well, it's not just the GOP we're going to be looking at, guys, because every single one of these people that's running for president, well, logically, may become president, and their beliefs and policies are going to affect our lives likely in one way or another. So we will be covering the Democratic debate. That's right. Right after the debate's over, we're going to be recording a podcast looking at everything that's been going on the Democratic side of things. We'll record a reaction show in the style of libertarians in living rooms drinking liquor, meaning we'll be drinking and we'll be talking and we'll be having a good old time and looking at these Democratic candidates for the very first time on this show. Should be a very interesting time. Until then, folks, live long and live free.
Editing and mastering is John Dauber.